This is what I was talking about. I said the Strong's Concordance. This is the book. See how thick it is? Gives you an explanation, says it's the exhaustive concordance. So all the words that are being used in the King James Version are in this book. So if you want to know something, you just have to go to it. It's in the back room as reference for each and every one of us. Okay, let's now look at the following part of our study on the biblical interpretation. Let's now look at just short for the Bible's cultural context. I said already, and I think I have to repeat this, that the Bible is written 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. I mean, not that we don't know when it is written, but it was written over a period of more than 1,600 years. In that time, many things differed, but also the background was totally different. When Moses wrote the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, he had a certain worldview in mind, and that worldview came at least partly from the worldview of the Egyptians, because he was raised, he was taught, he was educated by the Egyptians, and so that was in the back of his mind. And the Egyptian worldview had a lot to do with their religions in plural, because they had a range of gods, and the gods changed over time. So when he wrote material for what we call the Bible or the Old Testament, he was influenced by what he quote quote knew. And when you read the text in the book of Genesis, you will see that it gives you at least to say a slightly different worldview than what we have today. Moses was not concerned how to explain God. He never did. He never explained who God was. What he gave us is, in the beginning God created. No explanation who this God is, no explanation what this God is. The God is being presented in the text as a practical God. That was part of his worldview. That was his culture, was Moses' culture. And so when you look back and you try to understand, you have to think about, okay, this is part of the Judeo-historical worldview. I can imagine there was a difference in worldview when the people of Israel left Egypt and compared to the time of Jesus. Because in Jesus' time, the religion, the Jewish religion, was partly influenced by what we can call the Greco-Roman culture. One of the very specific differences was that there was a translation made from the original Hebrew to or into Greek, making it available. Wow, making it available in a language that was the trade language of the world at that time. And this again had to do with a Greek ruler, Alexander the Great, who introduced the Greek language as a universal language in the centuries before Jesus Christ. So you see that there is not only you can see the difference by just looking at it, but when you read the text of the Old Testament, many times it's like, it doesn't feel easy. Well, it should not feel easy, because the text is up to 3,500 years old. So it's not telling about the highways and the byways we have today. It's not telling about mega cities like Mexico City or New York City or Tokyo or, no. The biggest city they knew was Rome. And as far as we can decipher, it must have had something like 1.2 million people living in there, which was gigantic at that time. It is a middle-sized city today. So you cannot just compare numbers. Because of the cultural context, we try to understand what was going on. But they did not try to understand what was going on, or what was to be going on in their future. Of course not. They were not concerned with that. The only one who was concerned with that was the Lord God himself. And so he put in materials that were culturally okay at that time, and they are culturally okay today because we can understand what the culture was. The Hebrew culture, Jewish culture, the Greco-Roman culture. And that gives us a good idea about what is happening. So when we look at things that are happening in the Bible, we know it feels uneasy. When you take a passage from the Bible, remember that passage is written in a cultural context. So it has, whether we like it or not, it has cultural elements. And those cultural elements have to be explained by the ones who is using that passage to preach the gospel. Whether that's in church or outside of church, you still have to do that. Otherwise, you will not be able to pass on the real meaning of the text itself. So you actually distort the real meaning of the text if you don't take into consideration the fact that there are cultural elements in it. So the steps to go on and understand the cultural context to do so, we need to have access to not only the Bible, because we need access to the Bible for sure, but we also need access of what is given to us as Bible resources. One of them I just showed you, that is the concordance, but there is much more. I mean, there are Bible encyclopedias, there are commentaries on the Bible, and the more you use commentaries and encyclopedia, the better you can present what was written in the text 2,000 to 3,500 years ago. So you need explanation. You need, that's step number 2, you need to look up the passage for understanding the passage, and not only for understanding that you will understand it, but that the people who you're talking to also need to have that understanding of the Bible. Otherwise, they will have the wrong understanding of the Bible verse. And so you're actually misinforming them if you do so. So what you have to do before you come up with a cultural context, you have to write down the different materials. You have to write down what is good and bad, and how it functions, and how we looked at it. So you have to take notes and use those notes when you go back to the passage you want to talk about. Okay. There are a number of elements that are part of what we call this cultural context. One is a geographical element. Not just the fact that Israel is 1,000 kilometers away from here, thousands kilometers away from here, but when you read the Bible, they're actually giving us a number of geographical elements. For example, David moved the capital city from Hebron to Jerusalem. So, where is Hebron? Where is Jerusalem? Where is Israel? Okay, so you need to have that type of information. And in a lot of Bibles, you will find maps, but not all of the Bibles have maps. I mean, like the one I have here, the small type Bible, it ends with text. It doesn't go into graphic material. In other Bibles, you have other material that's being mentioned there. That's fine, but not all of them also have a map. And so here you don't have a map, you have how to read the Bible. In other Bibles, you still have this maps available. And that gives you a good idea, so that can bring you up to date to where Israel is, where Jerusalem is, where Hebron was, what type of difficulties the people went through. What does it mean, the road to Jericho and from Jericho to Jerusalem? Why would people take that road? Um, that is geographical material we need to present. For example, when you talk about the Good Samaritan, um, remember it's a parable. It's not a real story, and it's good to understand what the first century people understood when Jesus was telling them. He was telling them about a man going from Jericho to Jerusalem. Why would a Samaritan go that way? It's a dangerous path. If you know that, you can give it to the people, understand what the danger was all about. And not just say, okay, there were robbers. Yeah, well, there were robbers. Where were the robbers? The robbers were everywhere. But you can situate where and when. And that's a good thing. Okay, although you have to remember it was a parable, not a story. But yeah, it's a good thing to give that type of information as background to the people, so the people will get a better understanding of the story itself, because you took the initiative and you took the time to study it. And so the people are blessed because you have been blessed also. Your trouble, your work brings in blessing to the people's life. And that is absolutely important. So geographically spoken, we have an idea. There's also the political idea, the political elements. We are not talking about a free country when we talk about the Gospels. The free country was the time of the judges and the time of the kings. Well, even partly because you had these powerful neighbors. That was in specifically Egypt and the Mesopotamian rulers, the Assyrians, the Medes and the Persians. They were not too friendly. Assyrians were cruel, the Babylonians were also cruel. So all of them had a political system in place. And you need to know a little bit about the political situation in the text you're looking at. I mean, yeah, this is difficult to say exactly where to go because it depends on the text you were taking. When you go to a text before the exile, it's a different explanation, but because you most of the time speak about the political situation in Israel itself, or whether it's in the undivided country, the United Kingdom, or the separated, divided kingdom. It's divided in north and south. The 10 tribes were north and the 2 tribes were south. So that's one thing. And then you had the invaders and what political system did they bring. And when you speak about the time in between the last prophet and the beginning of the New Testament, we're not talking about the real time, we are talking about the things that were written in the New Testament. It begins with the story about Jesus being born. the people the political issues in those different times were different. The story about Joseph in Egypt was totally different from the story of Daniel in Persia. And it was different from what Jesus did when he was alive, because they had different political rulers. The biggest ruler there were in the whole history of Israel was the Roman Empire. Nobody had seen a political system so elaborated and so strong as the Roman Empire at that time. So it is important for us to pinpoint exactly when we speak about, for example, when we speak about certain things that Paul went through, and he asked to go for before the emperor. How could he do that? I mean, there's a political system in place. And so you see, different from what Peter went. I mean, Peter never went to meet the emperor. No, Paul went, but Peter did not. Okay, you see, they live in the same time, the same era. Paul is the younger and Peter is the older one, but still, I mean, they live under the same political system, but their experience with the political system is totally different. So that's the political system. Paul is, for example, saying something about the conscription that the Roman soldiers could do. They could just ask someone, well, not ask, demand from someone to take care of their armor, of their weaponry, to clean it or to carry it, going the extra mile. That's where that idea comes from. And then you have the economic, financial elements. Of course, you have money. The Romans used money. They learned that from the Greek, and the Greek learned that from the centuries before Christ. They learned how to finance things, and they have seen how other countries or other civilizations, the Egyptians, the Medes and the Persians, how they used money to finance, but not only to finance, but also to make sure that the people were, for example, paying taxes. So the money could come into the central banking system. And so you see, economics are important. So what they did was they had several types of coins. That is the way to pay things. Some of them were silver, some of them were gold, some of them were copper. And of course the value was different. It is not like what you have in today. There's a strange thing going on with coins in the world. It always puzzles me, and it's still going on. That is that a coin with a higher value is smaller than a coin with a lower value. I don't understand. You know, in Europe they stop making small coins of 1 and 2 euro cent, because it cost more to make it than the value of the material or the money itself. But in the time of the Romans, the only thing they had were the coins, and the coins were made by a local ruler or by the ruler of the empire. But older coins were also used, so you can find coins for that are mixed. I mean, you could have a Assyrian coin mixed with Roman coins, and Egyptian coins with Median coins, because of the fact that this was happening. But they were always trying to find out the value by the weight of the coins, whether it was gold, silver, or copper. Of course, you had people who were rich, you had people who were poor. You had people who had nothing in their life anymore, and on top of that, some of them were slaves. So they had, in Israel, you had people who had so many debts that they had to sell their own body. But in Israel, you had the time of Jubilee, and when the Jubilee was coming, you were set free from slavery. So there was even while the Romans were ruling, there was still things going on in a different way in Israel, because they had more or less universal rules before anyone else had. So you had economic, financial, health and wealth, but also and poverty. You had slavery. You had, there are stories in the Bible about money, about finances. For example, in the book of Ruth, when they pay a price as how do you say that? A redeemer price. So Boaz redeemed Ruth. A strange thing. I mean, that would be almost buying a wife. We can almost say that's what he did. That would be in today's situation in the 21st century. That would be unacceptable. But still, the dowries are still being paid. So they are buying a female to be their wife. Okay, and then you have what is called the religion elements. Of course, you had different religions. Every tribe, every nation, they had their own religion or religions. The Greek had religions. The Romans had religions. The Assyrians had religions. The Persians, the Medes, the Egyptians, the Nabaeans, all of them had own religion. The Canaanites, they had different religion, and also the Jewish religion was a religion among the others. The Jews built a temple for other countries, for other tribes. Why would you build a temple without the image of your God? Well, it was the unseen God, an invisible God. So how do you know he exists? We have something. I mean, we have a statue, and you can see that that's our God. Yeah, well, the real God doesn't need a statue. So he had temple worship, you had religious education, you had a system of Levites, you had a system of Kohens, priests, and then after the exile, you had a system of synagogues, you had the system of scribes. What I'm saying is the situation of the Jewish religion is different in the 15th century BC when you compare it to the 4th or the 5th century BC. And when you look at what happened in the time of the New Testament, it was again different, where you had all those things together. The temple, the synagogues, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Kohen. Okay, and then at that time there was only the 2 tribes, and the 10 tribes were gone. Not completely, but they were gone. And then you had, on top of all the problems they already had with the whole range of systems they had in place, then you had the Samaritans. They had their own temple, they had their own priests, they had their... Okay, so it's getting more and more complicated. But you have to explain it. For example, when Jesus is healing the 10 people with leprosy, one of them comes back because he's Samaritan, because they're at the border of Samaria. Okay, there's a specific link between the person himself and his temple. He has to walk a few hours. The others has to walk 2 days. So the 9 who were healed had to walk 2 days to go to Jerusalem. He had to walk a few hours to go to the Mount Gerizim. So you see, it's not the same. I mean, and it's happening at the same time with the same people, and still there are different rules, there are different religions, and Jesus is not telling to the Jewish people, you're right and the Samaritans are wrong, or to the Samaritans, you were right and the Jews are wrong. I mean, he's not telling that. I mean, he's not going with the flow, but he's also not going against them, because he is bringing a salvation, not just to the Jewish people, but to the world, including the Samaritans. And to prove that, you go to Acts 1 and you will see that Jesus is saying, you go to Jerusalem, you go to Judea, you go to Samaria. The Jews, the converts to Christianity, they had to go to Samaria. Excuse me, that's our enemy, isn't it? No, it's not your enemy anymore. You go to the end of the world, to the end of the earth, wherever that is. Okay, so you had religious elements, you had the Samaritans, you had a number of feasts and celebrations, you had, and the celebrations were always about something that happened in the past. For example, the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles was a celebration because of the time they went through the desert. Somebody called it a pilgrimage to the desert. I'm not sure whether you could say that, but okay. So, except for geographical, political, economic, religious, you also had philosophical elements. Yes, philosophical elements, because the philosophers of Greek, they were well known. They were well respected, especially among the people who have studied. And one of them was Paul. And he had a good idea about what the philosophers were saying. So, or he had contact with them, or he read material of them, or he studied them in the past, and he knew exactly what the difference was between the different groups who were in Athens at the time he was there. But outside that, you have, for example, John writing about the word, the logos. The logos was a philosophical idea. And so John was bringing the philosophical idea of the Greeks, and he was applying it to a person, not to an idea anymore, but to a person, namely the Lord Jesus Christ, the Logos, the Word of God. So you see, the philosophy is much more than just something that happened in Greece. It was applied by the New Testamentical writers, at least by Paul and John. For example, when Paul had a problem with the Corinthians, the problem was about the body. What is the body, and what's the value of it? And Paul was referring to something Jesus had said. Okay, so next to all those other elements, we have social elements. Social life in biblical figures. For example, a very simple thing. In John 2, you have the wedding. Weddings. In the beginning of the book of Matthew, in the book of Luke, you have the story about Mary and Joseph, and they were betrothed. They were not married at that time, they were betrothed, they were engaged. What is the engagement entails? What is the value of the engagement, and how did the people look at it at that time? Not what we think about engagement and so on and marriage. No, what did the people there then think about it? What was the value of betrothal? What was the value of a marriage? What was the value of the husband or the husband to be building a place so he could take his wife and live together? Okay, so see, a number of stories are highlighting these specific social elements. What is the value of the birth of a son? What is the value of the domestic life? What was the intrinsic value of a slave? How do you go about? How do you relate to a slave, even if the slave is not yours? How do you relate to that person? Okay, and so all these social elements are part of the background of the New Testament. So we have to see, we cannot avoid it. How were the women treated in antiquity? What was the position of the slaves? What was the work of a fisherman? A store owner, did he build his own store, or did he ask someone else to do so? What was the work of a shepherd? We meet them both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Jesus is actually using the idea of this. I said, I'm the good shepherd. What about the nard we talked about? The value of material goods. What is the Bible saying when it speaks about prosperity? You know, it has nothing to do with what we now call prosperity gospel. It's totally different. And when people use texts speaking about prosperity, prosperity at that time, in general, is, you can almost say, if we can let the ends meet financially at the end of the month, that's prosperity. Because you had enough, you had a roof above your head, you had clothes on your body, you had food to eat, and so on. Whatever that means. Okay, whatever that meant at that time. But that was prosperity. When the harvest was good, it was prosperity. I mean, they could not travel 1,000 miles with that type of prosperity. But prosperity was something that was happening at that time. When they had enough, that was it. And when they were not to pay too much taxes to the Romans, that was prosperity too. Well, whether the Romans were the legal owners of the country or not, yeah, we can a specific example of using what we call the cultural context is something we already spoke about. Remember the story about Jesus coming together, and the woman came in and she poured out the small bottle of nard over his body just before he was going to die. The whole setting is typical as a cultural context of the Bible, because you have all those things together. You had the disciples, you had Jesus, you had an outsider coming in, and you had a place where they met. Maybe it was an outsider's place anyway. So that's what you when you speak about the application of a cultural context, or you look for the cultural context. Remember, the nard had to come from North India, Nepal, all the way by a trail of 2,700 miles, close to 4,000 and so much kilometers, on camelback. Okay, so you see, those are all elements of culture. Why would people go that far to fetch an art? Well, because they could do it. So financially, economically, there was a possibility. Okay, so the conclusion about this specific historical cultural analysis, it yields an abundance of details, and it adds richness. It sounds like a prosperity gospel. It has riches, depth and understanding of the passage and the text. So it makes us a better interpreter and makes us a better preacher. Next time we are going to look at the biblical context itself.